Sometimes, love doesn't arrive with grand gestures, it comes quietly, in a single look that changes everything. Welcome to real and deep love, where stories aren't about perfect people, but about real hearts finding each other in imperfect moments. Tonight's story, That Night Changed Me, is about two souls drawn together by something stronger than reason, where silence spoke louder than words and hearts dared to be honest for the first time. It's about the pull that can't be ignored, the surrender that heals, and the breath that stays long after the night fades away. Stay with me till the end, because this isn't just a story, it's a reminder of how love changes us, even when it's not supposed to. It started like the faint hum of a song that had always been there, just too quiet to notice. A voice that only became clear when the world around finally grew still. It wasn't supposed to happen, not then, not with him. And yet everything about that moment felt like it had been waiting in silence, waiting for the right night to finally breathe. Every time the eyes met, something paused a second too long, a look that lingered before both turned away, pretending it didn't mean anything. The air would change when he was near. It wasn't just attraction. It was recognition, the kind that doesn't come from sight, but from memory, as if somewhere long before the souls had already met. It was never spoken, not once. Words would have ruined it. It existed in the quiet, the brush of a shoulder, the shared laughter that came too easily, the way conversations always drifted into something that felt unguarded. There were others around, there was life and noise and obligations, but between the two of them, there was always that undercurrent, a quiet pulse that refused to fade. That night, the world outside seemed to melt away. Maybe it was the way the lights were dim, or maybe it was the way everything that had been unsaid suddenly became too heavy to carry any longer. The silence wasn't comfortable anymore. It demanded to be broken. A single look was all it took. Not a word, just that look, the kind that strips every wall and leaves you standing there with everything you've been hiding, suddenly seen. Every heartbeat felt louder, faster. It was as if the body remembered something the mind had been trying to forget. There was a trembling in the air, a question unspoken but understood. One step closer, and the distance between them vanished. The world shrank into the space between two breaths. Everything that had been restrained for so long slipped away in the quiet gravity of that pull. It wasn't about touch, not at first. It was about proximity, the closeness that made every sense awaken. The smell of rain, the warmth of breath, the sound of a heartbeat that wasn't one's own. The room itself seemed to fade into a blur of shadows and light, and for the first time, there was no pretending. The connection that had been quietly building for so long finally took form, raw, unfiltered, real. It felt like coming home and falling apart all at once. Every hidden feeling, every stolen glance, every unspoken truth came rushing in. The emotions were too big to fit inside a single moment. Time didn't move in a straight line anymore. It folded, bent, wrapped around the rhythm of breathing. There was fear too, the kind that comes with finally being seen. The kind that whispers, this could ruin everything, but it didn't matter, because for once there was no choice, no decision to make. The heart had already decided. Every second carried weight, as if the universe had paused to watch. Every movement felt both inevitable and sacred, something larger than the two of them. What happened that night wasn't planned. It was something that had been quietly waiting beneath the surface, finally allowed to exist. When words finally came, they were soft, fragile things, more like prayers than sentences. There was laughter too, the kind that escapes when nerves and joy collide. There were pauses filled with silence so alive it said everything words couldn't. It wasn't about what was said. It was about what was understood, that this was more than a fleeting moment. It was the kind of connection that changes the shape of the heart. Once it happens, nothing fits the same way again. The walls built from fear and pride no longer hold. The heart starts beating to a rhythm it didn't know before. That night became a point of no return, not because of what happened, but because of what was realized. It wasn't about possession or promises. It wasn't even about love in the way the world describes it. It was deeper, a recognition, a merging of stories that had run parallel for too long. For the first time, the soul felt reflected back, seen without the need for explanation. The night stretched endlessly. Time felt different, slow, suspended, forgiving. Everything was bathed in a kind of quiet glow that only exists when two people stop fighting what's always been there. The body felt lighter, the heart heavier with meaning. And in that stillness, there was peace, not because everything made sense, but because it didn't need to anymore. When the dawn began to touch the edges of the sky, the world started creeping back in. But something within had already changed. The air felt different, lighter and heavier at once. Every ordinary sound, the hum of the city, the soft rustle of morning, felt distant, as if they belonged to another life. It was impossible to return to what was before. That night had drawn a line through time, a before and an after. The magnetic pull that had brought two souls together didn't disappear with the light. It remained, soft but unyielding, buried somewhere deep, where truth lives quietly. In the days that followed, there were glances, the same kind of almost silent smiles. But behind them, something new, and understanding that what had been shared couldn't be undone. It had changed everything. The world might never know what happened that night. It didn't need to. Some things aren't meant for the world to understand. They exist only in the space between two hearts that once found each other in the dark and decided, even for a single night, to stop running from what was real. That night didn't end when the morning came. It lived on in the smallest details, in the way a song could suddenly bring back warmth, in the way certain words carried echoes, in the way silence now felt like memory. There are nights you forget, and then there are nights that mark you, the kind that teach you what connection truly means, what it feels like to be alive in every sense, to be both fragile and infinite. That was the night everything changed. That was the night that defined what love would mean from then on. There is a moment in every story where pretending becomes heavier than truth. For the longest time, everything had been kept behind carefully built walls, words chosen with caution, smiles measured, distance maintained like armor. It was easier that way, safer, but safety has a way of dulling the heart. That night, safety broke. The air between us had changed. It wasn't charged with the quiet pull of before. It was softer, heavier, filled with something fragile and real. Everything that had been hidden beneath laughter and polite silence began to surface. It was in the way his voice trembled when he spoke, the way eyes searched for courage in the other's face. It wasn't about attraction anymore. It was about truth. Every fear was there, the fear of being too much, of being misunderstood, of losing what little peace had been kept by staying silent. But honesty has its own kind of gravity, and once it starts to pull, there's no stopping it. Every guarded word began to crack. Every carefully rehearsed line vanished, leaving only what was real. There was a pause, long and trembling, before the first confession slipped out. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost clumsy, spoken like a secret that had been aching to be free. The kind of truth that shakes when it finally finds a voice. The kind that carries years of restraint in a single breath. And in that fragile honesty, everything shifted. The walls that had been built from fear began to crumble, not with noise, but with gentleness. There were no defenses left, no pretense, no cleverness. Only two hearts trying to find each other through the wreckage of their own doubts. The eyes did most of the talking. There's a language in silence that only those who have been holding too much can understand. It said, "I see you. I'm not afraid anymore." It said, "Whatever happens next, let it be real." Every hidden fear surfaced, the fear of being broken again, of losing what wasn't even fully theirs yet, of hoping too deeply. But honesty has a strange way of turning fear into tenderness. The more truth was spoken, the lighter it all became. The closeness wasn't in touch, it was in the rawness of being seen. When masks fall, something sacred happens, a kind of trembling peace. The moment when the heart, stripped bare, finds itself accepted instead of rejected. That was the miracle of it all. Not love declared in grand gestures, but love quietly revealed in the way two people stopped pretending. There were no promises that night, only truth. Truth in the sound of breathing, truth in the slight shaking of hands, truth in the way every word felt like both a confession and a release. Everything that had been heavy for so long began to dissolve in the space between honesty and forgiveness. There was pain, too, the kind that comes with realizing how long both had been living half-lives, too afraid to feel. Tears came without warning, not from sadness but from relief. It felt like exhaling after years of holding breath. The walls were gone, and with them went the weight of silence. It's strange how the smallest gestures can carry the deepest meaning. The way a hand reached out and was met halfway, the way that simple touch spoke louder than 1,000 words. It wasn't about desire or need. It was about recognition, a quiet understanding that this connection was something neither had planned, yet neither could deny. Honesty made everything quieter. There was no rush to explain, no need to define. Just being there, breathing the same air, was enough. It felt like forgiveness not for anything either had done, but for all the time lost in fear. There's a kind of freedom that comes when walls fall. It's not wild or loud. It's gentle, steady, like finding a rhythm you didn't know you were missing. The world outside that room still existed, but it no longer held power. The only truth that mattered was the one that had finally been spoken. And then came the stillness, the calm after the storm of honesty. The heart wasn't racing anymore. It was steady, full, alive. Every word exchanged lingered in the air, like soft echoes of something sacred. Nothing needed to be said to fill the silence. The silence itself was enough. The night stretched quietly. Every moment carried a depth that felt infinite. There was no turning back now. Once truth is spoken, it can't be unheard. Once a wall falls, it cannot be rebuilt the same way. The heart remembers freedom too vividly. Later, when the world began to creep back in, there was a new kind of understanding. The connection wasn't just emotional, it was something that reached beyond reason. Something that made sense only to the two who had lived it. The kind of bond that no explanation could capture because it existed in feeling, not in logic. It wasn't perfect. There was uncertainty, fear of what came next, of how to live with this new honesty. But underneath it all was peace, because even if it all ended, even if distance returned, that night had already given something irreplaceable the knowledge of what it meant to be truly known. The morning after was soft. The world outside was the same, but everything within had changed. The walls that once kept everything in had become unnecessary. What was left was a heart stripped of defenses, raw but whole. There is a certain kind of love that doesn't demand possession or promises. It asks only to be felt, to be seen, to exist in its purest form. That night was exactly that, a surrender not of self, but of fear. A surrender that made room for something deeper to begin. It's hard to explain how something so quiet can be so powerful. Maybe it's because truth doesn't need noise to change a life. It just needs courage, the courage to let the walls fall, and the heart speak louder than reason. And when it does, everything changes. There are moments when time no longer moves in seconds, but in heartbeats. That night became one of them. Everything outside grew faint, the sound of cars, the ticking of the clock, even the weight of the air, all of it faded until only breath remained. The rhythm of two hearts slowly learning to match. There was no need for words anymore. Words had already done their part, stripped the walls, revealed the truth. What came after was quieter, yet far louder in its meaning. Every heartbeat was a confession. Every breath was a promise that neither dared to speak. The closeness was unlike anything known before. It wasn't about reaching out or holding on. It was about the stillness in between. That fragile space where trust lives, where the slightest movement means everything, where silence carries more weight than language ever could. The world outside could have ended, and it wouldn't have mattered. There was a kind of eternity in that moment, fragile but infinite. The kind of feeling that doesn't shout or blaze but hums quietly beneath the skin, asking to be remembered. The light was soft, touching the room with a faint golden haze, the kind that turns everything into memory even as it's still happening. Breathing felt heavier, not from fear, but from meaning. Each inhale carried the scent of warmth and closeness. Each exhale felt like letting go of everything that had come before. Nothing moved fast. It was all slow, deliberate, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to make room for what was happening. Every glance, every slight touch, felt like the drawing of a new line between two lives that had once been separate but now overlapped in perfect quietness. There was a weight to it, not heavy like burden, but sacred like truth. The kind of weight that reminds you that what's real always demands to be felt, not just seen. Every second lingered, stretching itself just enough to be memorized: the warmth of the air, the tremble of fingers, the way silence became the safest place on earth. It's strange how something so simple can carry so much. Just breathing together as if the world had never known rhythm before this. That was the moment when trust took form, when every piece of hesitation melted into understanding. There was no rush to close the distance further. The connection didn't ask for more. It asked to be felt, to be believed, to be held without being possessed. It was fragile, yes, but in that fragility lay its beauty because it couldn't be forced, only allowed. The eyes said everything. They carried a kind of wonder, the quiet disbelief that something this real could exist. That two people, once strangers, could find such stillness in each other's presence. The kind of stillness that doesn't silence you, but makes you listen harder. Every heartbeat became a language. It spoke of longing, of release, of a love that didn't need to be named to be known. There was no boundary anymore between what was felt and what was remembered. Everything blurred into one pulse, one breath. It wasn't perfect. There were small stumbles, nervous laughter that broke the silence just long enough to remind them that they were human, not dreams. But even that felt precious, the trembling honesty of being real, flawed, alive. Somewhere between breaths came peace, the kind that seeps quietly into the soul, leaving warmth in its wake, the kind that doesn't demand anything more than presence. And in that peace, something inside healed, not all at once, but enough to make the heart believe again. There's something eternal about the way a moment like that holds you. Even when it's over, it doesn't end. It lingers in sound, in memory, in the rhythm of breathing long after the night is gone. It's not the kind of eternity written in time, but in feeling. When closeness finally gave way to distance again, it wasn't a loss. It felt like a pause, like the world needed a moment to catch up to what had just happened. The air carried traces of everything that had been felt: trust, warmth, surrender, truth, all suspended in that delicate space between heartbeats. It's hard to describe the silence that follows something so alive. It wasn't empty. It was full of meaning, of quiet gratitude, of something too big to be spoken out loud. The kind of silence that doesn't separate but binds. Even as the night thinned into dawn, the stillness stayed. The first light touched everything with gentleness, like it understood the sacredness of what it was witnessing. Nothing loud, nothing grand, just quiet understanding. And in that light, there was the realization that not every connection needs a forever to matter. Some live for a moment and change everything. Some begin and end in the span of a few shared breaths, yet carry the weight of a lifetime. It wasn't the intensity that made it unforgettable. It was the tenderness, the way everything softened: voices, thoughts, fears, the way time folded itself around the simplest truth, that for one night there was no past or future, only now. Sometimes when the mind drifts back to that night, it's the quiet that comes first. The sound of breathing, the steady pulse, the feeling of being fully present. That is what remains, not the words, not even the faces, but the breath between. The place where everything felt infinite. There are moments you live once, and then there are moments you live forever, again and again, in memory. That night became one of those sacred, fragile, eternal. A night where love didn't need to be spoken or promised. It simply existed, alive between two breaths. That was the moment everything stopped being imagined and became real. That was the moment when the breath between us became everything. The morning came quietly, as if afraid to touch what the night had left behind. The light slipped through the curtains in thin golden lines, soft and hesitant, falling across the room like a whisper. Everything looked the same walls, the same air, the same world, yet none of it felt familiar anymore. Something invisible had shifted, the kind of shift that doesn't make noise, but you feel it in the bones, in the way breathing suddenly means something new. The air was still warm from the night before, carrying the echo of what had been shared. Silence lingered, not awkward but full, like the room itself was holding its breath, not wanting to break whatever this was. There was no rush to move, no words to fill the space, just the quiet realization that nothing would ever be the same again. It's strange how love sneaks in. It never arrives loudly or asks for permission. It begins in the smallest moments: a shared look, a trembling word, a quiet touch, and before you realize it, it's everywhere, in everything. That morning, love wasn't something to name or explain. It was simply there, pulsing beneath the skin, undeniable and alive. There was a kind of stillness between them, soft and knowing, the kind that only happens when both hearts finally stop hiding. Every barrier that once stood tall had fallen, and in its place was peace, raw, tender peace. Outside, the city was waking. The world went on like it always did. People walking, cars humming, the sound of morning routines drifting faintly through open windows. But inside, time hadn't caught up yet. The world could rush if it wanted. This moment refused to. There were no promises spoken, no declarations, just glances that said everything words could never hold. There was something sacred about that kind of honesty, the unspoken understanding that love didn't need to be owned or controlled to be real. It just was. The mind tried to reason, to pull everything back into logic, to name what had happened. But the heart wasn't listening. It had already moved beyond reason, into a space where truth doesn't need explanation. What had taken root could not be undone. There was beauty in the simplicity of it all, in the soft light on his skin, in the way the morning seemed to listen, in the silence that wasn't empty but full of everything that had changed. Every breath carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken things: gratitude, wonder, a quiet ache. It wasn't a fairy tale kind of love. It wasn't perfect. It was real, messy, beautiful, unexpected. It had grown where it shouldn't have, against all sense, all timing, all plans. And yet, it had grown strong, steady, impossible to deny. There was a moment when eyes met, and everything was understood without needing to be said. That look carried a lifetime: the fear, the surrender, the belonging. It wasn't about forever. It was about now. And somehow that was enough. The morning light kept changing, growing brighter, softer. With each passing minute, the world outside became louder, more awake. But inside, stillness remained, that quiet, heavy kind of stillness that only follows after something true. Every thought of what came next felt distant. What mattered was what was this moment, this truth, this love that had taken root so quietly, so completely. It didn't need to be justified. It didn't need to be labeled. It simply existed, and that was everything. There was a tenderness in the way silence stretched between them, in how it didn't feel like absence but presence. The kind of silence that says, "We know." The kind of silence that asks for nothing except to be felt. For a moment, the heart almost wished to go back to before, when everything was simple, when walls still stood. But then came the realization that those walls, no matter how safe they felt, had also kept out everything beautiful. The ache of love was better than the emptiness of safety. The risk was worth the breath it had given. When movement finally came, a small shift, a quiet inhale, a faint smile, it carried with it the weight of understanding. Love had changed everything, not in the way people imagine, but in the way the heart beats differently after it's truly known someone. Once that happens, the rhythm never goes back to what it was. The world outside would never know what had happened here. It would keep spinning, unaware that somewhere within it, two lives had quietly intertwined in a way that defied reason. That something sacred had been born, not in chaos, but in calm. Later, when steps were taken, when words were finally spoken, they were careful, soft, uncertain, but real. There was a strange comfort in the awkwardness of it all. Love didn't demand perfection. It just asked for honesty, for presence, for courage. And even as distance began to return, as the world slowly found its way back into the room, the feeling stayed. The love didn't fade with the morning light. It simply changed form from something that filled the air to something that lived quietly within. It would stay there, deep inside, in the quiet corners of thought and breath. It would appear in moments of silence, in half-remembered songs, in the ache of wanting and the warmth of memory. That's what love does when it's real. It roots itself in places it can't be seen but never leaves. The morning had come like any other, yet everything about it had shifted. The heart was no longer the same. Something had opened, something irreversible. And though the world outside looked untouched, the world within had been rewritten. It's strange how love can do that, how it can change the way light feels, how it can turn ordinary air into something holy, how it can make a simple morning feel like a beginning and an ending all at once. Nothing looked different, but everything had changed. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Real and Deep Love for more true, emotional love stories. Leave a comment below, tell what that one night means to you. Until next time, keep believing in love that's real, love that changes everything.